The following is a production of the Dallas Genealogical Society. For more information, please visit our website at dallasgenealogy.org.
So we are so excited to have Tony here today talking to us about finding Atlantic shipping records. Please help me welcome Tony Hanson.
That's all we have time for. Any questions? Now we'll see if we can get the technology to work here, and then I'll be really happy. There we go. Okay, so as Patty mentioned, in my background, my father's parents immigrated from Norway. My mother's grandparents all immigrated from Germany, and that's primarily my area of interest. And amongst other things, I got interested in how they got here, which is what led to this presentation, because it's difficult. And I'm a little surprised by that. Just some numbers to kind of lie. There was 45 million immigrants who entered the United States prior to 1914. That's a lot of people, including all of my parents and grandparents and all that. Most of them came by way of the Atlantic. There weren't many trains or planes or anything like that prior to then. So you would think with all of that traffic and all those people and all those boats that this just ought to be falling off a log easy, and it isn't. Because finding these records is really, really difficult, just like getting your slides to advance. Let's try that again. Okay, who cursed me on the technology front today? There we go. So as recently as 2010, according to the census, some 3/4 of the United States population descended from people of European descent. So again, you would think with all this European blood flowing around and all these European people going back and forth, finding records would be easy, but it really isn't. And so that's really the whole purpose of this. I got investigating this, and there's just so much to know about this. I think it's key to understand kind of really what's available and what isn't available, so you can focus your search and hopefully find your own records. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to look at, how do they travel? Spoiler alert, ship. Why did they travel? Some of the regulations which drove the records, which hopefully we're going to find as a result of knowing about all this. Some terms and some concepts, including something known as transmigration. We'll talk about that. And I'll point out some online resources and some search strategies that hopefully will enable you to be successful in finding the records about your immigrant ancestors. I'd like to start with just a little bit of terminology. I really, really would. There we go. So emigration with an E refers to the act of leaving a country with the intention of going someplace else. Transmigration is the act of passing through a country just kind of while you're on your way from someplace else to someplace else. And then immigration with an I is arriving in a country that you intend to settle to. So my Norwegians emigrated from Norway, transmigrated through England, and immigrated into the United States. So immigration, it gets used a lot in the literature, and it's just important to understand what those terms really mean. Again, they crossed the Atlantic. They traveled by ship. There weren't a lot of other options at that point. Sail was really about the only choice up until about the middle 1850s. A normal uneventful trip took 7 to 8 weeks on a ship. It was said if you're lucky, it would take less than 4 weeks. If you're unlucky, it would take more than 12 weeks. Could be a long time. Because people were traveling by sail and at the mercy of the winds and currents and things like that, things were very unpredictable. You never really knew when your ship was going to come in and when it was going to arrive. So immigrants would start congregating around ports that the ships would be departing from. And they sometimes would have to stay there for a month or two for the ship to come in, for it to arrive. So that means this entire trip could take 2 to 5 months. And I think about my great-grandparents who came here with a family of, I think, 8 people altogether, including an infant. It's just amazing we're here because of what they did. It's just truly, it blows my mind that anybody would do that. One of the interesting facts in the early days of sailing, if you wanted to eat, you had to bring your own food and water. You were required to bring supplies to last for 6 weeks and hope that the trip didn't take 12. About 1850, as competition came along, some of the ships that were sailing out of Bremen and Hamburg, which might be of interest to Kyle back there, they started providing food for their passengers kind of before anybody did. And then by about 1873, for some reason, all the lines started saying, okay, we'll provide food for everybody. So they didn't have to at least carry the food, although you still had to bring your own eating utensils and your own bedding. So I imagine, well, we'll get to that later. The thing to keep in mind is that immigrants were just another form of cargo. These ships were primarily sailing because they were bringing goods produced in the United States and North America back to Europe. And they were taking some stuff back to North America again, but not so much. So they had a lot of space on the ship. A lot of times they sailed in what's called ballast. They'd put rocks or sand or something in there to keep the sailboat on an even keel. And somebody figured out that, well, in addition to taking back the manufactured goods and things that were taken back, we can take some people too and maybe make some money. So immigrants were just kind of an afterthought, and they were on ships that were not designed to carry people. These were cargo ships. And in some cases, I read of stories about where the ship's captain would just basically sell the right to sell passage on their ship to somebody, and that person would just cram as many people as they possibly could into the ship, making a lot of profit for them and a little bit for the ship's captain too. But in many cases, the conditions on these ships were really deplorable. It was just, you can imagine again on a sailing ship for weeks or months, bad weather, not good food. It just must have been truly awful. Fortunately for everybody, steam came along by about the mid 1850s. Steamships became viable and they started making the Atlantic crossing, which was nice because things went a little quicker. They were a little more predictable, although there were still sailing ships during that period. 1865 was the first year where more people traveled by steam than by sail. And then by about 1880, steamships had pretty well taken over at least the passenger traffic by that time. The good thing about steam from the point of view of the immigrants was that things were a little more reliable and you could kind of count on scheduling. So now you didn't have to camp at a port someplace and hope your ship showed up. It was a little more predictable and it was easy to say, okay, I know when it's going to depart and I know how long the trip's pretty much going to take and when I'm going to arrive. And when to hit the right button. And the crossing time continued to go down. So we went from, kind of a minimum of 4 weeks, sometimes 12 or longer, to by the end of this period before the outbreak of World War I, it took about a week. So it's a significant reduction in time and in comfort for everybody involved. Now, trains also had an impact on immigration. That's a little odd thinking we're talking about sailing the ocean, right? Well, initially the ships that sailed out of ports were where the immigrants left from were at ports that were easy to get to because you could travel by boat in the country. So you could go down the Rhine River and get to Rotterdam or Antwerp, get on the ships and connect them that way. Well, as the steam ships or steam trains came along and as the tracks got built out and as the trains became more widespread and more common, all of a sudden it opened up the possibilities for what ports you sailed out of. So you didn't have to just be limited by where the river in front of your house flowed to. You could get on a train and get someplace very quickly and fairly easily. So now this opened up more ports as possibilities for immigrants as they departed Europe. On the arriving side, when they got to the United States, again, they had a lot more transportation options. The trains in this country could quickly pick you up from the ship and take you to wherever it was you were trying to get to in this country. So the steam boats and the steam trains both together really kind of revolutionized the immigration process and the way that people traveled. I've already talked about that. So next, why did people come? Why would you risk, an 8 or 12 week trip? Well, in many cases, they were trying to just find some place where they could eat. There was food shortages all over Europe and people were facing famine and things sounded a heck of a lot better, even after a 12-week trip on a sailboat. There was a lot of oppression going on, a lot of religious oppression. There was economic opportunity that was a big attractor. There was the lure of cheap or free land in this country and slavery. It's just a fact that we had a lot of people that came here involuntarily during this time as well. In looking at this, historians generally kind of divide the migration up into 3 great waves. There was the first wave that occurred prior to 1820, the second wave from 1820 to about 1890, and then a third wave again from 1890, basically towards the outbreak of World War I and then kind of ending shortly after that. So let's take a look at each of those because it's important to understand kind of what was going on to understand what you might be looking for and what might be available in terms of records. So the first wave is referred to as the period of organized migration. So you didn't just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to get on a boat and go to America. So it just didn't happen that way. There are many European countries, many European powers that had a foothold in North America at the time. So you had Spain and you had France, you had Great Britain, and then of course, the United States itself, and then even Russia, way up there in Alaska, all of whom kind of had an interest in who came, how they came, and what they did. So there was a shortage of labor. It was a new country. There was a lot to do. We needed people to cut down trees, run shops, plant, crops, chase Indians around, all of that. So we needed a lot of help. At the time, the ports that were getting a lot of the trade from North America were in Rotterdam and Antwerp. So again, that's where the empty ships were. That's where a lot of the immigrants went to, got on the ships and sailed back to North America. So during this period, that's why you saw a lot of people from that part of Europe coming to the United States, of course, and from, all of the British Isles as well. So these were primarily Protestants from Northwestern Europe. There's a lot of 1.2 million people had arrived in the United States prior to this 1820 as part of this first wave. And again, there were soldiers, there were missionaries, there were settlers for some of the chartered colonies that were established at the time, indentured servants, people who had been exiled from the country, convicts. We took them all. We didn't really care. And again, there was also, during this time, a large influx of slavery. So I want to talk about that just specifically for a moment. Slaves were first introduced into this country back as early as 1619. They came to Virginia. Most slaves in this country had arrived by about 1780, so definitely part of this first group. And it's estimated that, by 1808, when we finally banned the importation of slaves in this country, there was about 800,000 slaves in North America, a large number of people. And in fact, at the time of the 1820 census, 16% of the people living in the United States were slaves. So large group of people. From a point of view of records, though, there just hardly are any. These people were not viewed as, the slaves were not viewed as people. They were kind of viewed as cargo. And so there just wasn't much information kept about them other than just at a very high level. It's just, it's an unfortunate fact, but that, if you have people that, started out as slaves in this country, there just are no records available of, when and how they came here. Just a very unfortunate period of world history. Philadelphia was the major port of entry in North America at the time. And so people coming from Germany, as I mentioned, were primarily those people that came down the Rhine and came into North America on those ships. So we had a lot of agricultural Germans. And then from the British ships coming from the British Isles, we had a lot of Scotch Irish, and they settled kind of east of the Alleghenies around the Philadelphia area. So that's just kind of important to keep in mind if you have relatives that arrived, about that time, that's likely where they came from. The second wave began about 1820 and ended about 1890. And this is referred to as the period of autonomous migration. And this was a time when people said, I don't want to go there because it seems like it's a much better life for me, and I'm going to make it happen either individually or as a family, or sometimes you'd see groups of people would come together and travel as a group of people coming here. And this is because we needed help. We had, again, had rapid industrialization going on in this country. We had a lot of jobs for people. It didn't require a lot of skills. And so it was easy to come over here and get jobs in some of the factories and things that we had going at the time. There was a lot of barriers that had existed in Europe to immigration that had gone down. Thanks to Napoleon, the idea of serfdom and all that had kind of gone away. And during this period, it became a lot easier for people living all over Europe to pull up roots and say, I'm heading to America. I don't owe allegiance to this guy living up in the castle anymore. I'm out of here. This was a period of a lot of unrest. There was a lot of, again, ethnic discrimination going on that forced a lot of people to feel compelled to move. There was a lot of military conscription going on in Europe that people just didn't necessarily support. And so they just saw an alternative and a better opportunity, or an opportunity for a better way of life by going to North America, and they did that in large groves. There was even some government policies going on in some countries that actually encouraged people to migrate. So there was a lot of push in Europe to kind of encourage people to come to North America at the time. And again, as I've already talked about, the advances in migration were very rapid during this period with the steam ships and the steam trains. Took less time, less money, and was just more possible for more people to take advantage of all that and travel, and they did, came in very large numbers. During this time, New York was a major port. It kind of overtook the Philadelphia port, primarily because of the shift of where people were going. There's a lot of drive to get into the interior of the United States, and it was easier to get into some of those parts of the world by coming into the port of New York. So during this period that New York became the major port of arrival that it was. We acquired a large block of property from France in 1803, which included the port of New Orleans. And again, if you think of ships sailing and grabbing goods and taking them back to Europe, there were a lot of ships that went to New Orleans. And so they also had a lot of people that ended up sailing those ships and returning back in New Orleans. So that was a major port of entry. It wasn't quite as popular as the New York port because it took another 2 or 3 weeks to get to New Orleans to sail down there. I've read that the ships that sailed down there just weren't quite as nice. Not that the New York ones were great, but these apparently were even crummier. And travel up the Mississippi was not really, a pleasant trip at this time either. There was, the boats were kind of slow. The steamships of the time had a propensity to have the boilers explode, which kind of ruins everybody's day. And there was diseases and things. So a lot of people, even though it was a longer journey, still preferred to come into New York and travel inland. But a large group of people did end up in New Orleans and come up that way too. So it's just, you have to be open to all possibilities as you're starting to search. If you're having trouble finding your ancestors, how'd they get there. In that first wave I mentioned, there's a little bit over 1 million people. In this wave, 15 million people arrived. Large number of people. These were immigrants coming from Ireland, trying to get away from the potato famine. Germans trying to get away from some of the failures of their democratic revolutions, about 1848, 1850. That's when my Germans came. Scandinavians, there was food, crop shortages all across Europe. You always think, well, it's just the potato famine. Well, no, it happened all over Europe. And so large numbers of Scandinavians came at this time. And of course, a large number of Chinese also came to North America about this time as well. The vast majority of arrivals, at least coming from Europe, crossing the Atlantic, as I mentioned, arrived in New York City. Partly in response to the large numbers, the city of New York established Castle Garden because they wanted to try to provide a little bit of a safe landing zone for immigrants. People came in before the establishment of Castle Garden, they really got taken advantage of. People would, jip them out of the money. They'd offer them, hey, come stay. I've got a really swanky place you can stay, and it'd be really awful. There'd be lures of jobs that were just basically sweatshops. And so Castle Garden was an attempt to try to at least provide some safe landing haven at the time to make it a little bit easier for people who were coming into this country and to have a little bit of control over how they entered our society. The third wave began about 1890 and extended, through World War I and towards the end of that. And this is really, really big numbers. In the third wave, there's more than 22 million people that arrived, large numbers. These are mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe, so countries like Italy, Russia, the Austro-Hungary region. 75% of the people that arrived came through New York. So if you're guessing where they came, that's a pretty good place to start. It was during this time that the federal government stepped up to taking over managing immigration. And so that's when Ellis Island was created and the federal government took over the processing of immigrants and greeting them as they came in. And of course, immigration was severely restricted during World War I and picked up a little bit towards the end. But then air traffic started to take over and some other things occurred. So that's kind of the end of this third wave. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go the other way. So let's talk a little bit about the regulations that were enacted during this time, because those drive the records that are of interest to us as historical researchers. So 1820 is a very pivotal year to keep in mind as you're thinking about immigration, because prior to that point, there were no shipping records. So you could just sail up, drop anchor, splash ashore, and you were there. Welcome, glad to have you. So in 1819, there we go, Congress passed the Steerage Act of 1819, but also referred to as the Manifest of Immigration Act. And this is largely an attempt, or largely a response, to try to start doing something about the deplorable conditions for the immigrants that were arriving on ship. It was, again, some of the stories about the conditions of those ships when they pulled into harbor are just awful. And some laws were starting to get passed both in Europe and in the United States to improve the conditions and to keep people from just really cramming millions of people into awful conditions and dumping them off on our shores here. What it required, amongst other things, was that the ships had to start creating a manifest of passengers, and they had to provide that manifest to the U.S. Customs agent upon arrival in the United States. And at that point, I guess, then we started kind of counting noses and saying, wait a minute, you can't put 800 people on a ship that's only 40 feet long. And they started trying to enforce some rules and to put a little bit of controls over how people were brought into this country. But the documentation that was created did record the name, the age, the gender, the occupation, the country of origin, and the ultimate destination for each passenger on the ship. And so these are the records now that, as genealogists, of course, we want to find. The forms, although the information was standard, the forms themselves were not. So as you start looking at these forms, you'll see they all look a little bit different because everybody's kind of free to print them or produce them any way that they wanted to. Standardization would come a little bit later. But here's a typical record from 1820, and you can see it just kind of records all the information that we described. Bear in mind, though, that these records were only required for ships that arrived in United States ports. This becomes very important as we understand the concept of transmigration. A lot of people came via Canada and walked or horse and buggy or by train or whatever into the United States. So although we had a requirement for records for ships pulling into United States ports, we had no such requirements for people who came in through Canada. And so for a long time, until 1865, in a period of 45 years, anybody that came to North America and landed in Canada had no ship records. And the number of people that came through Canadian ports during this time, at the peak, I believe it was estimated that about 40% of the people who arrived in Canada were heading for the United States. So that's a big gap in the records if your folks came in through Canada. There's some additional events and additional laws that occurred during this period. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened. And for those of you not real familiar with geography, that connected the Hudson River, which is connected to the Atlantic Ocean, and ultimately it dumped into Lake Erie and the whole Great Lakes system. So that really revolutionized travel into the interior of the United States. That's part of the reason why New York became such a popular destination, because it was easy to, to get from New York into cities like Milwaukee and Buffalo and some of the other cities on the Great Lakes, because that's where people wanted to go. That's where the jobs were. That's where the land was. In 1845, the British made some changes to their shipping regulations and their taxation and made it more desirable for their ships to land in Canada rather than sailing into the United States. So again, that had the unfortunate consequence of driving passenger traffic up into Canada where we didn't have the records. But there was always push and shove and jostling between the major shipping powers of the world for who had dominance over that. And this is just one of the things Britain did to kind of get ahead of us. Finally, in 1865, Canada did begin documenting immigrants. They had similar types of records to what we implemented back in 1820. So at the Canadian port of entry, the shipmasters had to present the manifest to the Canadian authorities. The major ports of entry in Canada were Quebec and Montreal in the summer on the St. Lawrence Seaway. And then when that froze up, ships instead put in at St. John's and Halifax, a little further out in the ocean, just because they couldn't get any closer due to the ice buildup. The records they kept are very similar to what was required in the United States at the time. So, again, name, age, profession, country of birth, destination, and where they got on the ship. And the forms looked very similar to what had been in use in the United States for the previous 45 years. So by 1865, we now had a situation where anybody arriving anywhere on the Atlantic coast did have to have documentation of their having been on the ship. So from 1865 now, there's more hope that you can start finding documentation. But again, records being the way they are, it's been a couple hundred years, they didn't all survive. They're not all, legible. So although the record probably was created, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is available today. Most of them are, but sometimes you get real unlucky and they are not going to find your records. The laws continue to change. So in 1883, the U.S. began requiring an enhanced record. It was called an immigration passenger list, also known as a ship manifest. And this just added additional columns of information that had to be recorded. So you started to see more information about the immigrant, where they were born, where the last place of residence, what their marital status was, if they'd ever been in the United States before, and their destination, a little more information about where it was they were going. So as you move forward in time, these records start getting a little more interesting and provide a little more information about the people that were traveling. In 1891, the United States established inspection and deportation regulations. Now, what this meant was that we started getting a little more careful about who we allowed into the country. We wanted people that could come in here and support themselves and take care of themselves. And so if you were unhealthy, if you were blind, missing limbs, what have you, we had the right of saying, sorry, this isn't the country for you. And we said to the shipping company, take them back. We don't want them. Now, this didn't happen to large numbers of people, but it just points out that we started getting a little more selective about the people that we allowed into our country at that time. You had to have a minimum amount of money, never really codified what that was, but the immigrants all knew, so they all said, yeah, I've got $20. And like, okay, come on in. We also established our first immigration inspection stations at the border with Canada. So we were taking steps to start tightening control over who got into our country and how they came in. So we started having people at the land stations and started asking questions for people as they came across, on trains and however they were coming down from Canada. The manifest forms themselves continue to have additional information added So over the years, we added some more information, for example, on the race of the immigrant, added more information, more personal information about the immigrant themselves, and more information about relatives that they had either in the old country or where they plan to go to in this country. So finally, in 1895, we made a deal with Canada, and we said that our regulations now must be applied to all Canadian passengers if they said, we're going to the United States. So we started applying our rules to the Canadian arrival. And we actually placed immigration officers in Canada and worked side by side with the Canadian officials. So the Canadians would do their thing. If they decided, okay, you're healthy enough and have enough money or whatever, come on over here. We got an American you want to talk to. And then we did our thing. And we did all our paperwork. We screened them, did that all right there at the port in Canada. I think in part because we wanted to be able to, if we rejected somebody, to be able to again say to the shipping company, you got to take these people back because we don't want them here. And you kind of solved that right there while the ship was still quayside, and then took it from there. So we also provided documentation to the immigrants right there at the port so that it would be able to board the trains heading for the United States. So we did some additional documentation and provided some documentation to them to make sure that only the people that had been screened were able to get on the trains and across the border. So this is kind of a boon if you're looking for records. If people did come into Canada during this time, you will have the ship record that the Canadian government required from the ship's captain. And this would list everybody that was on the ship. Then we took over, and the United States officials would now create another manifest for the people on that ship that said, we're going to the United States. So it's actually kind of a second manifest. And sometimes you get lucky and the handwriting's a whole lot better than the original. Sometimes you're not so lucky. We also created these transportation cards. And these were what were given to the immigrants, and that was basically their ticket to get on a train to prove that they'd been through the American immigration process at the port. All of these records, I think I might do this here. Okay, and I want to point this out too. Back on the Canadian records, if you look real closely, sometimes you'll see some little gems of information. I know that's impossible to read on the screen there, but that's actually a list of the Canadian Pacific Railroad trains that were at the dock to meet the boat when it came in. This immigration wasn't just kind of a random thing. You typically booked end to end. So the shipping companies knew who was going and where they were going. They'd make arrangements like this. And so if you read real carefully, you can see where the trains were actually going to once they left the ship. And so during this period, you would find that the ship dock had the train tracks right next to it. And you'd get off the train or get off the boat and get on your train. And you think of immigration, I always think of my European trips, walk around London and take in the sights. You got off the boat on the train and you were on your way. So anyway, that's just something worth looking into. When you do find the schedules, it might give you some insight as to how your immigrant ancestors got from wherever the boat landed to where they were ultimately headed. So by 1895, we had things fairly well tied up in this country. We had anybody coming to the United States all being documented and handled the same way, whether they came in through Canada or where they landed in this country. And we have the border pretty well secured with agents there screening people as they came down from Canada. In 1906, Canada began to document the immigration of Canada, or depends on which side of the border you're on, whether it's emigration or immigration, but basically people who were leaving Canada and coming to the United States to live. The Canadian officials were now at the border on the other side from the Americans, and they were basically doing the same things that we were. So that by this point in 1906, the border was now kind of more like we know it today. You've got to be able to prove, who you are and where you're going and why you're going there. And at the same time, we started doing the same thing with the Mexican border. If you may recall that previous map there, I didn't have the little dashed line. So prior to 1906, we had, no immigration requirements to come in from Mexico, but from 1906 going forward, we did. And I went the wrong way again. This thing is just backwards. So finally, and this is, if you think about it, this is relatively recently. 1906 was the first time we kind of had all of our borders more or less document-wise, at least sewed up, that you had to produce papers and have records as you crossed the border, regardless of how you came into the country. So that's not that long ago. I went the wrong way again. This thing is going to drive me crazy. Okay, so with all of that as background, kind of understanding how and why and where and when, that starts dictating a little bit of a search strategy for you. Now, genealogy is genealogy, so you're going to start with the basics. And we're researching everybody, you want birth, marriage, and death, and all of the things, about children and parents That's just your kind of, block and tackling basic kind of genealogy. So that's the starting point for this. But you want to build that out, and you want to try to tease out any little things that are going to help you as you're going through the records, through the immigration records, trying to figure out, because you're going to find a lot of people with the same name, and as luck has it, typically with the same dates, birth dates. And you got to figure out, okay, is this, my am born as opposed to somebody else? And that's where this other information can really help you. So, as you are researching the person that you're trying to track down, you want any little factoid, any little rumor, anything that you can find that might give you a hint as you're going through the records. So, why did they immigrate? Were they giving away from something? Were they going towards something? If you have anything about a port of departure, I had one ancestor who had a little postcard from where they sailed from. It kind of gave me a clue. But if anybody's ever talked about the name of the ship, if you know who they traveled with, anything about the route, the port they arrived at, when they arrived, how old they were, or where they were going, any of these things are going to help you because they're going to be hints as you start going through the records to try to figure out, is this the right person and what record sets even exist and where should I be looking? The sources for these are familiar to us. We use these for many things, but if you've got naturalization applications, that's just depending on when it was filed and where it was filed, can be a bonanza for information like this. Remember that the U.S. Census in 1900 through 1930 recorded the year that the person entered the United States and whether they're naturalized or not. Church records sometimes can be very fruitful. Local histories from where they lived. If there's any oral family traditions that have been recorded, any personal family documentations, letters, and things like that. If they ever applied for a homestead for land in the United States, that also could be a good source. Just basically, it's game on for any kind of documentation, any kind of record you can find to just start getting a little better idea of where were these people coming from and where were they going and why. There's a lot of information online. And so that's probably a really good place to start because if you're lucky, you're going to find somebody online, and that's good. The basic information that you need to have to do online searching effectively is as close as you can find it, the date of arrival and their age upon arrival, and the full original name that was recorded in the shipping document. So the date and the age are two things that were pretty much universally recorded, and that's why they're really important because that's going to be how you'll start trying to winnow down, is this the right person? The original name can be a little bit tricky. Now, contrary to what many people believe, names weren't changed passing through Ellis Island or anything like that, but names were changed before the voyage began. And so my grandmother, my Norwegian grandmother, was born Inger Marie Anton's daughter. When she traveled to the United States, when she went to book her passage, she changed her name to Inger Marie Dahl. Dahl's kind of the Norwegian equivalent of Smith. It's a very common name. But she decided before she began the trip that she wanted her American name to be Dahl, not Anton's daughter. So when she booked her passage, that was how it was recorded. Now, Norway is also kind of unique as well. We'll touch on this later, but they also recorded the ships that were leaving Norway and going into England. We'll talk about transmigration in a bit. And I was able to find her record. It was recorded Inger Marie Dahl, but the person who wrote this down had put in parentheses Anton's daughter. So that was a nice little clue for me to have to help me know that that was really her record. But the important thing was she changed her name before she left. If I didn't know that, and I kept looking for Inger Marie Anton's daughter, it'd be a pretty fruitless search. So as best as you can, if you can find the name that they wanted it to appear on when they booked the ship package, when they got on the ship, that's what you want to find out, and that's what you want to start looking for. Now, there's a number of places that you can go to find online shipping records. So Family Search has a huge collection. Again, these are typically sorted by port of entry or port of departure. So you just need to go into the catalog, tell that you're looking for immigration records and what port that you're interested in looking for. And so, for example, they have a pretty large collection for New York. As I've mentioned, that's where the predominant number of people came into the United States from. Ancestry also has a large collection. You can winnow that stuff down by saying, I'm only interested in immigration, particular time period, and again, by the port that you're interested in, and that will narrow it down a lot, but it's still going to be a lot of records. And we'll come back to some search techniques and perhaps you can help yourself have a little more success there in a few slides. This is a really interesting site too. The German genealogy website has a section on immigration and immigration. Can you tell the distinction? EI. immigration. Anyway, they've divided it down by time frame because again, 1820 was such a pivotal year. If you're searching for people who arrived before that time, it's a whole different strategy than people who arrived after that time. So for the 1820 to 1940 time period that they're talking about on their website, they give you some general information, and then they go port by port and say, okay, here's the records in New York. Here's the records in New Orleans. Here's the records in Boston, and help you understand what record sets are available for that port. They'll even point out, like, you know, if it's Ancestry, if you have to pay for it, as opposed to the free sites, but it's a great resource to go through and identify at least what record sets are available and how you can access them. So you can see they've got records for Boston, Galveston, and online links to those. You can go back and look at the pre-1820 records that they have. It's a very similar sort of an organization, but the records that they're going to point you to are going to be a little bit different. They're not going to be an online database necessarily. So you use, you know, if you have an idea of what port they came into, you can click on that city and they will identify the records that they have. In some cases, they're going to be even books. And so you may have to actually go to the library and get some books if they haven't been digitized yet. But they do a pretty good job of identifying the particular books that are specific to that port, to that period of time. So you at least have, you know, like me, you walk into a library and just kind of like, oh, where do I start? At least you can hand this list to somebody and say, okay, I need to see a few of these books. And many of these have been digitized too. So that's what's changed a little bit over the last few years, is you don't necessarily have to be poring over books. You might get lucky and find that it's been digitized, and you can do it in the comfort of your own home too. I also recommend this book real highly, although it's a bit old and a little bit out of date, but They Came in Ships by John Coletta. He's been one of our speakers. We had him here in Dallas several years ago. But there's a number of things that still make this book really valuable. Number one, it's a 23-page bibliography. So again, he did a really good job of identifying all of these arcane, you know, various sources of information that might be the one little gem that you need to find your immigrant ancestor. He also talks about some search strategies. And so, for example, if all you know is the basics, you know, the birth date, the age on arrival, and the name, says, okay, depending on what period of time you're talking about, this is how you can go about and where you want to start focusing your attention. If you know at least their nationality, he's got some broader suggestions. If you know kind of how they came here, maybe they came as part of something like you know, an organized group settling a part of the country or some sort of thing, then here's again some additional stuff. So it's a worthwhile book to have, and a very good guide to kind of help you understand what the records are, where they are, and what you need to be focusing on depending on what it is you're trying to find. There's also this Immigrants Ships Transcribers Guild, and this is an interesting website. This is a group of volunteers that have been finding these manifests and digitizing them, transcribing them for you. When I put this presentation together the first time, it was a couple of years ago. I went back and updated it for this, and in the 2 years, they had transcribed some, I think, another 3,000 manifests. So they're quite active, and they're putting stuff out here all the time. So again, if you've not been having any luck with any place else, poking around this site might be a good thing for you, and you might just get lucky and find they've transcribed something for you as well. And don't forget Google. It is surprising what can turn up if you just go out there and just Google stuff. And I had really good luck. I was looking for some of my German ancestors, and I came across this information that had been published by a small historical society down in southern Missouri. They had a bunch of Germans show up there, and they thought, well, it'd be interesting to go back to where they came from. And they went to all the gazetteers and some of the publications, and they documented everybody that left that town and came to the United States, including my immigrants who didn't go to Missouri. They went to Wisconsin. But they documented them anyway. And if I hadn't done this Google search, I never would have found this. And so these little gems are out there. You know, a lot of us like to smugly say, well, it's not all on the internet, but a lot of it is. So you just never know when something's going to turn up. I've talked a lot about transmigration. That's the act of kind of going through an intermediate country on your way to where you really want to go. And it's important to understand that that was frequently the case for many people who immigrated. We've talked a lot about Canada. Many people came in to Canada and went on to the United States. Another one that's less known, though, is a little place in England called Hull. And so Hull, England is an interesting town. It came about because the British dominated the Atlantic trade route. They had the most ships, probably, well, they had the most ships, I'll leave it at that. And because of that, they also had lower cost and better service. And so what they did to build on that was they built these feeder ships lines in Europe. So they would sail to various European ports. They would collect people that wanted to go to wherever they were going, not just the United States, South America too. And they would bring them all to Hull, England, get them off the ship, put them on a train, send them someplace, get them on another boat, and send them on their way. So between 1836 and 1915, more than 2 million people passed through Hull, England very briefly. They weren't there long. What would happen is the ship would sail in, they'd drop anchor, and they'd wait until their train is ready to go. They'd hustle them off the ship, onto the train, and away they would go. And the train then would take them to whatever the port of departure was, Liverpool, Glasgow, London, Southampton, wherever, and they'd be on their way. And they probably walked maybe 100 yards in England, ship to train, train to ship, on their way. And Grimsby was another little town right across the water from Hull, England, that also was a pretty big one, but not near as big as Hull. My wife and I visited Hull several years ago. That is actually the immigrant station that people went through. They got off the boat. The harbor was much closer at the time. They've done some landfill and kind of pushed the water away a bit, but it was a short trip to here. The backside of this is actually the train station. So they would go in here, kind of wait for things to get finalized. They'd walk out the other door and get on a train. This is the view from the other side. This is the actual train station. I'm standing on one of the current train platforms right there. You can kind of get an idea of how long the platform for the immigrants was by that train that's parked over there. The platform actually extended through, and I think beyond that bridge off over there in the distance. So these trains were huge because of the number of people that they had that they were coming through here. And like I said, millions of people over this period of time took that short walk from the boat through there, onto the train, and on their way. The point is that when you see the shipping records in this country, when you finally find it, it's going to say they came from England. You're going, no, wait a minute, they're Norwegian. How the heck did they come from England? Well, that's how, because the British dominated the trade and they could get away with it. So just bear in mind that, when you're searching and you think, well, they're German, so of course they sailed from Germany. Not necessarily the case. It's also important not to fall into the trap I did about making assumptions about the route of travel or route, the way. My great-grandfather came from Norway, and I found his shipping information in 1903. He sailed from Norway, went through Hull, got on a boat in Liverpool, landed in Quebec. And I thought, okay, I know the rest of his family came in very short order. They must have come the same way, right? So his sons and his daughters and his wife all came by way of Boston just the next year. His other daughter came a year later. She landed in Halifax. My grandmother, when she came just a few years after that, sailed directly from Oslo to New York. The only member of my family that I know of that went through Ellis Island. They didn't change her name. So the point is that people then are a lot like people now. They were smart shoppers. And they were looking for the best price, the best ship, the best food, the best something. And every day was kind of a new day, and you could never be sure which boat, which line, which path they were going to take. So just don't fall in the rut. I spent a lot of time looking for them up in Quebec, and they weren't to be found there. A lot of people came, but not all stayed. So we had a lot of people who came to this country and decided they didn't like the food or the water or something and went back. Some just went after they had kind of established themselves here. I think to brag a little bit, like, I got 60 acres, and kind of bragged. And then sometimes when they sailed back again, would bring other people with them, kind of help shepherd the way. And then there are groups of people, mainly this was Italians I read about, but this happened for other nationalities too. We're kind of like migrant laborers. They'd sail over here, work for a while, go back to home for a while, come back again, work somewhere, go back home. And then maybe in the third or fourth trip, they had enough money, felt comfortable enough, then they'd bring the family with them. Now, the United States didn't keep much of any kind of record of people leaving. We did pretty good about people coming in again. So just don't be surprised if you find records of one of your immigrant ancestors arriving several times. It wasn't deja vu all over again. They're just going back and forth. It kind of surprised me how mobile people really were. I really thought, the travel was hard. You went there, you stayed there, but that wasn't the case. And this is also an interesting factoid too. The Canadians are a little slow on opening up land for land grants. The United States did that much earlier. The Canadians, particularly in the Western provinces, were trying to get their corporations. The corporations were thinking, we make money here. We want to own all this. Well, that didn't work out so well. So finally, in the beginning of the 1900s, the Canadians started opening up a lot more land. And in the 1900 to 1910 period, 44% of the people who took land grants in Canada came from the United States. There was a bit of an economic turn down in the late 1890s. I think there were some problems with crops too. And so a lot of people who had come here, however they got here, saw better opportunity in Canada and they skedaddled up there again. So you're just never really sure where they're going to end up. They did move around a lot. So it's surprising to me. Let's talk a little bit about these online search tips. There's a lot of records online and a lot of disappointed people because they can't find anybody. And there's some reasons for that. Bear in mind that this ship record was created prior to the ship even departing. So it was a record that was assembled before the ship sailed. The informant and the person writing the information down may not have spoken the same language. The informant may not have been able to read or write. So your name is whatever, is this right? Oh. Or maybe they can read and write, but it's an entirely different alphabet. People that use the Cyrillic alphabet, you write like you and I write, it's like, well, I can't read that. Write it the way I write, I could. So there's a lot of reasons why the information that was recorded might possibly have been recorded incorrectly. So just keep that in mind. Later on, then, of course, somebody had to index it. If you're going to search it, somebody had to index it first. So we've got all the problems that might have happened as the information was recorded at the time that the document was created that enters into this. But then you got things about handwriting. The person writing it down may not have had, in fact, all the ones I always find had horrible handwriting, it seems like. It's just bad luck. The document may have deteriorated over time. It may be hard to read. And so when you're searching, you need to kind of take all that into account. And this can even affect things like their age or their birth date. Numbers are really easy for search engines to differentiate on. And so they're very sensitive. If you say, I'm looking for, I know their age was 50, so I'm going to say I'm looking from 40 to 60. They're going to only show you people that are, between 40 and 60 years of age. They're going to throw everything else out. But if the index was wrong, your search isn't going to turn out real well. So you may know that person was 50 years old when they came here, but if it got indexed as 20, you're not going to find them that way. And these kinds of things happen all the time. Possibly the age was not even indexed at all. Perhaps that record was just so illegible that nobody could make it out and they just didn't put anything at all. And if you say, well, I know they were 50 and it's blank, it's probably not going to show up on the search engine. So, if you tried the refined search and you're not having any luck, you need to kind of open your mind a little bit and think of, well, what could have gone wrong and how can I get around that and perhaps find this record? So start playing some games with these dates of these ages. Have a really broad range, or perhaps have no range at all. Don't put the age of arrival, just put the date of arrival, or just put the age, or just put the date of arrival. Just either try all kinds of different things to see if you can perhaps get around some of these indexing problems that are making your records just getting thrown in the trash bin because of the way that it was indexed. And that's also true, especially with names. Names really got clobbered. And if you have a case like my grandmother where she changed her name and you're not aware of it, you've got to get around that as well. So for that, try maybe just only specifying a first name and don't even specify a last name. Or try just the last name and not the first name. Try it with and without some of these other dates that they're looking for. It helps to get really vague in what you're specifying when you're searching if you're having trouble finding records. Not just with immigration. This is true, in general, but this is a pretty good idea to keep when you're searching the immigration records. If the search engine supports some advanced search options, this is a good time to try those as well. So if they allow you to search for similar names, that's a handy thing. And even Soundex matches. We think Soundex is dead. That's such an old thing, but it's still a pretty powerful way of grouping names. And so if it has the option to do a Soundex-based search, sometimes that will pop something up that you can't find any other way. And also, this is a good time to break out the wildcard thing. So if you're not familiar with wildcards, let me just explain what they are. So wildcard characters are just special instructions to the search engine. And they just tell it kind of some rules I want you to follow in searching. And the most popular one, the one I use a lot, is the asterisk. And if you put an asterisk in a string, it just says, in this position, I'm looking for 0 or more occurrences of absolutely any character whatsoever. And that's pretty powerful. So for example, if I'm looking for HAN asterisk, what's that going to match on? Well, it's going to match on Hans, H-A-N-S. It's going to match on Hanson, whether it's spelled O-N or E-N. It's going to match on Hanson with 2 S's. It's going to match on Hans' daughter. So you can see that it's a pretty powerful tool for saying, I really want to broaden what it is that I'm looking for. And most search engines will support these wildcards and they can really be used to advantage. You may need to turn on exact match to make it work. That's just kind of a search engine dependence. Bear in mind, the asterisk can be used anywhere. It doesn't have to be at the end of a string. So I've got amborns, and that gets amborn, imborn, a lot of weirdness. So if I put asterisk born, I'm going to get anything that just ends literally in BRN, including amborn. Again, to the Scandinavians, daughter gets spelled a ton of different ways. And so doing this, putting that asterisk between the D, T, E, R, will expand on all of those different variables and all those different possibilities. So it's a very useful thing, very, I think, powerful when you start getting into situations where you've had all the problems happen to names that you have in shipping records. Another one that gets used a lot is a question mark, and that just says any character in this position, but there must be a character in this position. So again, if I do HANS question mark N, it'll match on ON, EN, IN, anything, but it has to have something in that position. So those are just a couple of wildcard techniques that might give you some success where you're having trouble. Also keep in mind that you can search for travel companions. If you know that as a family group and you can't find the husband, try looking for the wife or the name of children or anybody that you know was traveling with them, because you just might get lucky there. If you find that person, maybe you'll find the rest of the people you're looking for. When I was looking for my great-grandfather, I had no luck whatsoever, but I knew he was traveling with one of his nephews, Otto Lorentzen. I also know, in Norwegian, you have this patronymic naming thing. There's a lot of people named Otto Lorentzen in any given town. And what they would do is they would say, well, I'm Otto Lorentzen from the Honda farm, which is different than the Otto Lorentzen from, that farm. So the farm name kind of helped define who that person was, and I guess cut down a lot of confusion in these small Norwegian towns. So anyway, I started looking for him and found that I did find him, and he was traveling as Otto L. Honda. That's how he had registered when he signed up. And lo and behold, right next to him was a very, very faint great-grandfather of mine. So that's Hans Isaacson, although you have to really kind of know it to be able to see it. And then again, that's just a problem with people that index. So sometimes traveling companions can really help you find the people you're looking for. I also encourage you to consider other repositories. You may be searching for records in Family Search. Take a look and see if Ancestry has it or MyHeritage has it or some of these other online services, because sometimes they have different images which are better quality. Frequently, they've gone through different indexing process, or perhaps the indexers just indexed a little bit differently, and you just might get lucky and find the record over there. If none of this works, then you're going to be like Kyle back there and having to go back. We were talking before the presentation that you may have to go back to the country of departure. If you know that they came out of Hamburg or someplace like that, you may need to start looking to see what records exist from there. I'm not going into that because I've talked long enough already about this country, but you may need to start getting specific about the port of departure and researching that and seeing what records still exist from the time when your ancestors came through there, and see if you have some luck there. It's difficult. Newspapers can be interesting. There was a lot of excitement when ships came in, particularly back when they were sailing ships. And so you can find some really interesting information if you can find information about your ancestor's ship. So if you know about when and where, about when they came into New York, you can find articles like this. The Maritime Herald talked about the ships that cleared. Those are the ones that sailed out of the harbor and the ones that arrived. So you can see, when and where the ship came from. Sometimes you get tantalizing little tidbits like this one. This was the ship Eli, 39 days out of the Havre. It was in ballast and carrying 210 steerage passengers. So that's a case where the ship is coming back essentially empty, but they had room for 210 people to get in there, and were on their way to, I think it was going to Boston. But bear in mind, this is before the internet. There was no CB radios. There was no cell phones. And so, and a lot of storms and rocks and other things that made shipping very dangerous. And so it was very common as you passed on the ship to say, well, who are you? Where are you coming from? Where are you going? And then if that ship didn't make it to port ever, at least, somebody said, well, the last we saw them, and they're, 110 miles off of Boston or something, something must have happened. So anyway, just interesting little tidbits that you might get some illumination of how long the trip, where they came from, and things like that. I want to go back to Canada and talk a bit about the transmigration stuff. Remember, after 1894, things were handled a little bit differently, and these records still exist. So we have these manifests that the American agents created and these cards that they created. These were all shipped off into Montreal and filed there for a while, but the Canadians said, we don't want your American records, get them out of here. So somebody came up with the bright idea of sending them to St. Albans, Vermont. I don't know why, but they did. They were later microfilmed, and all the original records were destroyed. So the records don't exist anymore, but at least the microfilms do. And so this is the record set description. I have a hard time finding it every time I go to family search. I just paste that into Google and it takes me right there. So that's a shortcut that I used a lot in doing this presentation. But all of these images are there. There are very many of them. There are 4 million images of all these manifests and all these cards. But it's kind of interesting if you do get lucky and find, your immigrant ancestors, it just gives you a little bit more information and a little more insight as to where they went and how they went there. These are contained originally in 2 microfilms for each. So there's 2 microfilms for the manifests. These are chronological. And then they also had a periodic, like a monthly, here's everybody that we listed in the previous manifests. So a lot of documents there. There's another 2 reels of information that have all these cards. These things are sorted by sound decks on the last name and then first name and middle initial. So that you can kind of go search through there and hopefully again find yours. No luck with my Norwegians. I just cannot find those cards. I did find them on the manifest. I don't know what happened with the cards, but at least in the 2 out of the 4 million examples I looked for, I had no luck. So good luck to you. When you do find the SoundX conversion, you'll have to figure out which role it is that you're looking for, and then you can click on that, and then you can step through the images and look at them that way. If you get to this point and you still don't have the records, you just got to keep slogging. Be a good genealogist and document everything that you've done, include your references. Find all known sources of information. Get really diligent about what records might have been created. If you know the port that they came in, great. If you don't, your job just got a lot harder because you're going to have to guess. Sometimes creating a timeline of events helps. If you can narrow down, I know they wouldn't have left prior to this and they had to be here by then. At least you can narrow down the time frame a little bit and at least narrow down the scope of what you might have to look for. Guess. I'd start with New York if you don't know anything and go through all the New York records. And if you don't find them there, try Boston and try, it's just kind of a crapshoot at that point. You may be reduced to going down those 4 million Canadian records page by page. At least a few of them. But make sure you record everything that you've searched. What did you search? When did you search it? What were you looking for? Sometimes, particularly if it's an online record, they will get periodically updated and revisiting it is worthwhile. Sometimes it's the same old book and you don't want to search the same old book 2 or 3 or 4 times because you forgot you searched it last year. So good records can be your friend there. And this might be a point to consider hiring a professional researcher. So Kyle, again, I know you've got some specific interest in Germany. It might be worth hiring somebody who specializes in those German records to say to you, it's hopeless, you're wasting your money, or no, yeah, we can do something here. So we've reached that happy point where I'm done. So again, just discover as much as you can about the ancestry you're researching. Research the records that are available at the time and the place they immigrated. Consider all possible routes of travel if you don't know. Take advantage of the online records first and then get down and dirty with the books if you have to. Be creative in your searching and use wildcards. If you know when your ancestor traveled, it's really, really helpful. So take some intelligent guesses. Find those records that exist at that time. Anticipate that they're probably indexed wrong and anticipate that. Look for traveling companions. Don't assume they all came through Quebec. They didn't. And again, just document your research thoroughly because it's just helpful to know where you've already been and where you need to go. But more importantly, don't give up. New records are being brought out all the time. Some are being put on the internet all the time. And I'm just ever the optimist. So I'm hoping that I'm going to find all of my records before it's all said and done. Hopefully you will too. So with that, thank you for being so patient. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions I can. We do have a microphone, so if there's any in-house questions here, we'd like you to, my able assistant here, Nana, Todd. Susan's got one here. Oh, all right.
All right.
And I don't fight.
Do you have your presentation that we can download? Because I saw a website that I was interested in about Galveston immigration.
Yeah, so if you go into all of the notifications about here and the presentation, I'm going to put it online for a couple of weeks. I'll have the links there as well. I've got the PowerPoint version of all of my slides.
Yeah, okay.
So you can.
I have a question from the chat.
All of the,
Hold on, Kat. Susan, let's take online. So Kathleen, go ahead.
We have a question from the chat. Charles, would you like to go ahead, unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you for the good presentation here. I just wanted to know how common, if at all, for transmigration to occur through the Caribbean into the United States from Europe.
I didn't find anything in my research that talked about that as being a real hotbed, but it's certainly a possibility. I mean, it would kind of be an out of the way to get from Europe to the United States. Typically, you'd want to go a more direct, more timely route. But yeah, it's possible somebody could have gone to the Caribbean for whatever reason and then came here, but it wasn't a real popular thing to have done in this time period.
I see. And would the records be similar, the manifest passenger records?
Well, the record that the ship had to provide when they arrived in the United States, yes, they had to have that ship's manifest depending on what year they came here. So that documentation would be identical. What might have been recorded on the port of embarkation where they left, beyond that, I don't know. But it's a good thing to research. Let us know what you find.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, we have one more if you want, or Susan can go ahead from the
We'll take one more.
floor.
Susan's very patient.
Okay, so Larry Youngblood, are you ready to ask your question?
Sure. I've been trying to find records for my German ancestors who arrived somewhere around Pennsylvania before 1730, and I found nothing. It appears the records before 1730 were extremely poor. Any ideas?
So yeah, for the 1730 timeframe, you're not going to find any shipping records or lists of passengers on a ship unless you get really lucky. Okay, so if you're on the Mayflower, you're probably in luck. But for just a regular ship coming that way, you're going to be extremely lucky if you find the ship manifest. You're going to have to be dependent on other forms of documentation. So if they came here as part of a group of people settling, in a particular area of Pennsylvania, you might find some records like that. If they were part of an organized church, group of religious people, some sort of documentation about that group of people other than shipping records is going to be your only hope.
How do I look overseas?
Well,
Any luck there?
If you know where they came from, again, in many cases, there would be newspapers or similar types of things saying, well, Kathleen Murray just sailed for the United States. So you might find some information over there, but that's a little spottier. Language issues and that's it. But if you haven't had any luck here, that would certainly be what I would try next.
I have a naturalization record from 1739 where the gentleman says he was from Germany, and I match him by Y-DNA.
Yeah, see, there was no Germany in 1739.
Right. That was the interesting part. It looks like Palatinate, but I can't nail it down, and I can't find people who are willing to discuss records over there in that southwest part of Germany. They actually came here as Quakers, so it was before the William Penn time.
Yeah, I mean, I would pursue the Quaker line and perhaps find something within their own record set. Anything else about that person that you can find, but it's good luck.
It's tough. It's tough. I understand. Thank you.
Tough time.
Tony, this is Bernard.
Go ahead.
Those Germans coming in to Pennsylvania before the Revolutionary War were not British subjects. Therefore, they were all required to sign oaths of allegiance to the King of England, and many of those have been documented. And I'll put in the chat 2 of the sources.
Okay, thank you for that very much. Now, Susan, you've been waiting quite patiently here.
Okay, what about the military people that were moved between World War I and after World War II, moved by ships to Europe and other places around the world? Were they recorded as leaving or coming back into the United States?
I don't think we did a very good job of recording people that left, particularly, I'm guessing about like prisoners of war. We brought large numbers of Italians and Germans into the United States during the war and then shipped them back out again. And to be honest, I don't know if the military did much recording of that. There should be military shipping records, military records of people if they were in the United States military when they went overseas and when they came back, which you would pursue, hopefully through records that have survived up in St. Louis for a military search. Beyond that, I wouldn't know. I don't know.
Kind of to answer your question,
I was helping a friend who was born in Cuba. And I was able to find her ship records during the Bay of Pigs because she was adopted by a military family. I was able to find her ship record to get her and her adopted mother, whatever, out of the country and back in the country. I found military ship and plane records for her coming back and forth to the United States. But again, this was in Bay of Pigs time.
In the 60s, yeah.
Yeah.
So want to take the microphone back there with a question in the back row.
It's not really about migration as much as your last name. So Hanson, S-E-N versus S-O-N, because my Hanson ancestors are Danish. Can you give a little background on the different?
Yes, I can say without doubt that you had an ancestor named Hans.
But it doesn't necessarily mean it's Danish if it's S-E-N versus S-O-N. It's just son of or daughter of Hans.
Yeah. And as you know, I mean, whoever's writing the name down, sometimes E, sometimes O, but no, I had always heard that as a rumor that one was Danish and one was Norwegian, and I'd not find anything to support that.
Okay, thank you.
Kathleen, any more online?
No, but Bernie's put up some wonderful resources for migration. I'm wondering, maybe you can add these to your handout. And why not? Because we can't get them to everybody. But just as if you'll check the chat, people might be very interested in these. That's it, though. No more questions.
Okay. All right. Again, thank you all very much. I'm going to turn the podium back over to Patty. Thank you again for your kind attention.
Oh, that was excellent, Tony. Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. Well, I want to remind you again, January the 7th, we'll be having our next monthly meeting, and that will be with Patty Gillespie. She's been a popular speaker all over the United States and has a great presentation. I have seen it before, and it is very good. Also, just would like to wish you all happy holidays. We've got month of December and a lot of holidays coming up. So I wish you a happy holiday and thank you all for attending the program today. Any other news we need to share? I think we covered it all. All right, great. Thank you again and have a great rest of your day.
This has been a production of the Dallas Genealogical Society. If you're already a member, thank you. Your fees have been supporting these and other society activities. If you're not yet a member, please consider joining now. Go to dallasgenealogy.org and click on the membership tab.